So there's one last concept I want to show you, and this isn't necessarily only applicable to vertical and horizontal lines. It's applicable to any line, but I'm just going to use these as examples. So let's say I have this green horizontal line, and I don't want to draw this infinitely long line. I only want to draw the green line up until these 2 points. So what I can do is I can plug in some sort of restriction, right? We've talked about that in a previous video. To restrict how much of your line is graphed, what you can do is you can plug in these curly brackets, and then you can plug in some inequality that involves x, right? So here I want my line to be in between these two x values, an x value of 2 on the right and an x value of -5 on the left. So for this green line, I only want x values to show up between an x value of 2 on the right, that's the maximum x value I want, and the minimum x value I want, the smallest one, on the left is -5 here. So here, I want my x values to be kind of sandwiched in between the x value of 2 on the right and an x value of -5 on the left. There you go. So now I have this, and let's put this into projector mode so you can see the lines more clearly. So now I have this green line, but it doesn't go infinitely far to the left, and it doesn't go infinitely far to the right. It stops at -5 and at +2. It's only in between these values. That's what this inequality controls. And I can plug in that same inequality for this blue line as well if I like. So for this blue line, let's say I don't want it to go infinitely far to the left and infinitely far to the right. What I can do is I can say, hey, I only want it to hit this black line and stop, and hit this red line and stop. So these are my upper and lower boundaries. I only want a maximum x value of 2 graphed on this line and a minimum x value of -5 graphed on this line. So what I can do is I can chop it up. So x, I only want values in between 2 and -5. There we go. So now this blue line, it's stuck in between these x values of 2 and -5. So it doesn't go to the right forever, and it doesn't go to the left forever. It's sandwiched in between these values of +2 and -5. And I can do the same thing. I can do the same thing for this, this last horizontal line as well. So now I've got all of my horizontal lines sandwiched in between these two vertical lines with these restrictions. Now here, this is where we're going to need to learn how to introduce a new kind of inequality. All of these inequalities with x, they are technically called domain restrictions. Now, you don't have to remember this word domain, but sometimes it's useful to use it. You'll be using the word domain enough in Math 10, but for now we're just going to talk about these just like they're any old inequalities that provide restrictions on our graphs. Now, if we want to do the same thing on our vertical lines, let's say for this red vertical line, I only want to allow values that, that prevent it from going up forever and down forever. Well, let's say I want the red line to stop here, so I want it to have a maximum y value or a maximum height of +5. So here I want it just to have a maximum height of +5, and I want it to have a smallest or a minimum height of -1.5. Right here we can clearly see that this has a y value, not an x value, but a y value of -1.5. So how do I introduce an inequality to restrict this line, the graph of this line, so it doesn't go up forever and down forever? Well, for this horizontal line, what I can do is I can plug in another inequality into these curly brackets, but it won't be an inequality that involves x, right? For this horizontal line and this horizontal line and this horizontal line, I wanted to restrict the allowable x values that were graphed, But here, this red line only has one x value, technically, at -5. So I'm going to be restricting these y values that I've just mentioned, of +5 for the y value here, the maximum y value, and the minimum or smallest y value of -1.5. So let's restrict those y values. So I'm going to have an inequality that involves restricting y values. This is called restricting your range. You don't technically have to know that. But again, our tallest or our highest possible y value we want is 5, so that's going to go on the right here. And the smallest possible y value we want is -1.5. So if I introduce this inequality for this equation, this is the only part of the line segment that will be graphed. I can do the same thing for this black line right here. So here, for this black line, if I want to restrict how much of the line is graphed, what I can do is I can say I only want this line to show up for y values of in between 5, for y values in between 5, and for y value, sorry, I misspoke there. I only want this graph to show up for y values between +5 and -1.5. So here I only want y values to show up in between +5 and -1.5. And there you go. So that's how we can do range restrictions or restrictions for our y values. So for horizontal lines and all other lines of some non-zero slope, so basically for any line that isn't vertical, you can do restrictions on x. But if you specifically have vertical lines and you want to restrict how much of the line shows up, then you can't do a restriction in terms of x. You must do a restriction in terms of y. For vertical lines only, you must do your restrictions in terms of y. So hopefully that's relatively clear. Doing your restrictions on x is usually a good way to go, but again, if you have straight vertical lines, then you must plug your restrictions in terms of y, for inequalities in terms of y. So hopefully that's helpful. That's what domain restrictions look like, that's what range restrictions look like, and you will be using these inequalities in your art project.